Close your eyes and imagine standing at the threshold of time itself. You're at the beginning not just of civilization, but of a story so profound it would echo through millennia, transforming as it travelled yet never quite losing its original shape. This is the story of a god who became a serpent, a benefactor who became a villain, and a truth so dangerous it had to be hidden behind the veil of myth. This is the story of Enki, the Anunnaki god of wisdom, and how he slithered his way into the Garden of Eden. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself and let's dive in. You stand at the edge of a vast marsh where the Euphrates River meets the Persian Gulf. The year is approximately 5400 BCE, though such dates mean nothing to the people here. They know only seasons, floods, and the eternal rhythm of planting and harvest. Before you rises a mound of packed earth, and atop it, a simple mud brick structure no larger than a modern bedroom. This is not just any building. This is the first temple ever constructed by human hands. This is the house of the aquifer, the Iabzu, the earthly dwelling place of Enki, the god of the deep waters. The air here is thick with moisture and the smell of fish. Thousands of cart bones litter the ground around the temple, the remains of offerings made to a deity whose appetite for freshwater fish was as legendary as his wisdom. Inside the modest shrine, a small altar stands before a niche meant to hold the god's image. The priests who tend this place believe with absolute conviction that beneath their feet, far below the muddy soil and clay, lies the Abzu itself, the cosmic freshwater ocean from which all life springs. And in that subterranean realm dwells Enki, Lord of wisdom, master of magic, keeper of the secrets that separate gods from men. This place is Eridu, the Sumerians, who will flourish here thousands of years after this first temple is built, will call it the first city world. They will write in their king list that when kingship descended from heaven, it descended first to Eridu. They will say that before the great flood swept over the land, 5 cities existed, and Eridu was the eldest of them all. Archaeological evidence supports their claim in ways that would have astonished them. Excavations conducted in the 20th century revealed not just one temple, but 18 successive temples, each built directly atop the ruins of its predecessor, creating an archaeological layer cake of devotion spanning nearly 4,000 years. The god who dwells in this place is unlike any other in the Mesopotamian pantheon, where Anu, the sky god, is distant and cold, and Enlil, the lord of the air, is stern and quick to anger. Enki is approachable, clever, and profoundly interested in humanity. He is depicted in cylinder seals and stone carvings as a bearded figure wearing a horned cap, the symbol of divinity, with flowing streams of water erupting from his shoulders. These streams represent the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the very arteries of civilization. Fish swim in these waters, emphasizing his dominion over the life-giving fresh water that makes agriculture possible in this otherwise harsh land. But there is something else about Enki, something that the Sumerians knew and recorded in their hymns and epic poems. Enki bore an epithet, a title that would echo through the centuries with implications far beyond what his worshippers intended. He was called the Ushumgal, which translates as the Great Serpent or the Great Dragon. This was not merely poetic language. In Mesopotamian iconography, the Ushumgal was a specific creature, a divine beast with a serpentine body, 4 legs for walking, 2 horns, 2 wings, and a mouth filled with venomous teeth. When a god was called an Ushumgal, it meant he possessed terrifying power, the ability to curse and destroy with words alone. One Sumerian hymn describes Enki in stark terms. His word is a flood wave. The word of Enki is a flood wave. You are true with those who are true. You are not true with those who are not true. You are the venom of a viper set against humankind. His word is the venom of a lion that does not come out. This is no benevolent grandfather deity. This is a trickster, a being whose cleverness can heal or harm, whose words can create or destroy. And yet paradoxically, he is humanity's greatest benefactor. The paradox is embedded in the very structure of Sumerian theology. Enki's primary role in the cosmic order was to guard the Me, pronounced Meh, the divine decrees or principles that govern civilization. These Me were not abstract concepts, but something almost physical, perhaps tablets or objects that could be worn or carried. They contained everything that made civilized life possible, from the arts of kingship and priesthood to the knowledge of agriculture, metallurgy, writing, music, and even the social order itself. Enki was tasked by the supreme god Anu to keep these me safe, to prevent them from falling into the wrong hands, whether those hands belonged to rival gods or to humanity itself. Enki failed at this task, repeatedly, almost joyfully. The most famous story of his failure involves the goddess Inanna, the ambitious and sensual deity of love and war who ruled from the city of Uruk. In a text called Inanna and Enki, the goddess travels to Eridu and engages Enki in a drinking competition. Beer flows freely, the intoxicating brew that the Sumerians considered a gift from the gods themselves. As Enki becomes thoroughly drunk, Inanna coaxes him into giving her the me, one after another, more than 100 sacred decrees. By the time Enki sobers up and realizes what he has done, Inanna has loaded the me onto her celestial boat and sailed back to Uruk. Enki sends his servants to retrieve the stolen treasures. They pursue Inanna, attempting to reclaim the me through trickery and force, but the goddess outsmarts them at every turn. Finally, she reaches Uruk and distributes the me to her people, elevating her city above all others. Enki, hangover pounding and dignity wounded, can do nothing but accept his defeat. The knowledge has been given. Civilization has been seeded in the hearts of humans. This pattern repeats throughout Mesopotamian mythology. Enki is constantly giving away what he is supposed to guard. He cannot help himself. His nature as the god of wisdom compels him to share knowledge, even when such sharing defies the will of his fellow gods. This brings us to the first and most profound connection between Enki and the Serpent in Eden. Both are figures who offer forbidden knowledge to humanity. Both operate in defiance of a higher authority. Both change the course of human existence forever. The biblical Garden of Eden, as described in Genesis chapters 2 and 3, presents a deceptively simple narrative. God creates a garden in Eden, a place of perfect abundance. He forms the first human, Adam, from the dust of the ground and places him in this paradise to tend it. God permits Adam to eat from any tree in the garden except one, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The command is clear and the consequences explicitly stated. On the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. Then God creates Eve from Adam's rib, and the two live in innocent ignorance, naked and unashamed. Into this scene slithers the serpent, described as more crafty than any other beast of the field. The serpent approaches Eve with a question that is really a challenge. Did God actually say you shall not eat of any tree in the garden? Eve corrects the serpent, explaining that they may eat from any tree except the one in the middle of the garden, and if they even bore touch it, they will die. The serpent's response is one of the most controversial lines in all of Scripture. You will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Eve looks at the fruit with new understanding. She sees that it is good for food, pleasing to the eye, and desirable for gaining wisdom. She takes the fruit, eats it, and gives some to Adam, who is with her, and he eats as well. Immediately their eyes are opened, just as the serpent promised. But what they see first is their own nakedness, and they feel shame. They hear God walking in the garden in the cool of the day and hide themselves. When God calls out to them and discovers what they have done, he curses the serpent above all creatures, condemning it to crawl on its belly and eat dust all the days of its life. He expels Adam and Eve from the garden, and places cherubim with a flaming sword at the entrance to guard the way to the tree of life, ensuring that humanity, now mortal and aware, can never return to the paradise of ignorance. For thousands of years, Christian and Jewish theologians have interpreted this story as the fall of man, the moment when sin entered the world through human disobedience. The serpent is understood to be Satan, the devil, the adversary of God, though the text of Genesis never makes this identification explicit. Satan as a distinct figure would not fully develop in Jewish thought until much later, during the Second Temple period, and even then, the connection between the Eden serpent and Satan remained speculative rather than definitive. But what if the story is not about the fall of man but about the rise of man? What if the serpent was not an enemy but a liberator? What if the knowledge it offered was not a curse but the very foundation of human consciousness itself? And what if this serpent had a name that was simply forgotten, erased, or deliberately obscured as the story travelled from culture to culture, transforming in the process? This is where the ancient Mesopotamian myths become crucial. The Hebrew Bible, as scholars have long acknowledged, did not emerge in a vacuum. The Israelites lived in and among the great civilizations of Mesopotamia. Abraham, the patriarch of the Hebrew people, is explicitly stated in Genesis to have come from Ur of the Chaldeans, a major Sumerian city in southern Mesopotamia. During the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, when the elite of Judah were forcibly relocated to Babylon, Hebrew scribes would have been immersed in Mesopotamian culture, myths, and literary traditions. It is during this period, or shortly after, that most scholars believe the book of Genesis reached its final written form. The scribes were compiling, editing, and synthesizing older oral traditions and written fragments into a coherent narrative, and they were doing so in an environment saturated with Mesopotamian mythology. The parallels between Genesis and older Mesopotamian texts are too numerous and too specific to be coincidental. The most obvious parallel is the flood narrative. The story of Noah's Ark in Genesis chapters 6 through 9 bears striking similarities to the much older Mesopotamian flood myths, particularly the Epic of Atrahasis and the flood account in Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh. In both the Mesopotamian and biblical versions, a deity warns a righteous man of an impending flood, instructs him to build a boat, save his family and the animals, and promises that life will continue after the catastrophe. The details are remarkably consistent, including the sending out of birds to test whether the waters have receded. The scholarly consensus is that the Hebrew flood narrative is a deliberate adaptation of the Mesopotamian tradition, transformed to fit a monotheistic framework. The Mesopotamian gods are replaced with the single Hebrew god. The polytheistic conflicts and motivations are reinterpreted as moral judgments on human wickedness, but the bones of the older story remain clearly visible beneath the new theological flesh. If the flood narrative was adapted from Mesopotamian sources, what about the creation narrative? What about the Garden of Eden itself? Here the parallels become more complex, more fragmentary, but no less compelling. To understand the connection, we must turn to a text that is less famous than the flood myths, but perhaps even more important for understanding Genesis. This is the Adapa myth, the story of the first sage, the proto-human who was granted wisdom but denied immortality. Adapa was a priest of Enki at the city of Eridu. According to the myth, Enki created Adapa and endowed him with extraordinary wisdom and intelligence, making him a model of human perfection. Adapa served Enki faithfully, baking bread and catching fish in the marshes as offerings for the god's temple. But Enki deliberately withheld one gift from his creation. He gave Adapa wisdom, but he denied him eternal life. Adapa was mortal, destined to die like all humans after him. One day, while Adapa was out fishing on the Persian Gulf, the south wind, a lesser deity, blew with such violence that it capsized his boat. Enraged, Adapa used the magical incantations that Enki had taught him, and cursed the south wind, breaking its wings and causing it to cease blowing across the land. This act had consequences. Without the south wind, the climate began to change. The supreme god Anu, ruler of the heavens, noticed the absence of the wind and demanded to know what had happened. When Anu discovered that a mere mortal had wielded divine magic to injure a god, he was both impressed and disturbed. He summoned Adapa to his heavenly abode to answer for his actions. Enki, ever the trickster and protector of his creations, gave Adapa advice on how to survive the divine tribunal. He told Adapa to dress in mourning clothes and to flatter the two guardians of Heaven's Gate, Dumuzi and Ningishzida, by praising them and asking for their intercession. But most crucially, Enki warned Adapa that when he stood before Anu, the sky god would offer him food and drink. Enki told him this would be the bread of death and the water of death, and that if Adapa consumed them, he would die immediately. Therefore, Enki instructed, Adapa must refuse all food and drink. Adapa followed Enki's instructions exactly. He arrived at the gates of heaven dressed in mourning, and won the favour of Dumuzi and Ningishzida with his humility and eloquence. When he stood before Anu and explained his actions, the two guardians spoke on his behalf, and Anu's heart was moved. The sky god was so impressed by Adapa's wisdom and integrity that he made a spontaneous decision. He would grant this exceptional mortal the gift of immortality, elevating him to the status of the gods. Anu offered Adapa the bread of life and the water of life, the divine food that would make him immortal. But Adapa, remembering Enki's warning, politely refused. He would not eat, he would not drink. Anu was baffled and then amused. He asked Adapa why he refused such a gift. Adapa explained that his god Enki had warned him that the food and drink would be poisoned. Anu laughed. Enki, he realized, had tricked his own creation. By warning Adapa against the bread and water of death, Enki had ensured that Adapa would refuse the bread and water of life. Humanity's chance at immortality had been sabotaged not by divine cruelty, but by divine cunning. Anu sent Adapa back to Earth, still mortal, still destined to die, and with him, Adapa carried back the knowledge he had gained in heaven, the arts and sciences that Enki had taught him, now validated and expanded by his encounter with the supreme god. Humanity would be wise, but humanity would never be immortal. Now, compare this to the Eden narrative. In both stories, there is a garden or paradise where the first human dwells. In both stories, a deity provides for the human and places certain restrictions on him. In both stories, there is forbidden food that involves a choice between knowledge and immortality. In both stories, a supernatural being offers advice about this food that results in the human gaining knowledge, but losing the chance for eternal life. The structural parallels are undeniable, but the moral framework has been inverted. In the Adapa myth, the god Enki deliberately deceives his own creation to keep humanity mortal. Adapa's obedience to Enki's warning is what costs him immortality. In the Genesis account, the serpent tells the truth. When the serpent says, "You will not surely die, and your eyes will be opened," it is not lying. Adam and Eve do not drop dead the moment they eat the fruit. Their eyes are opened. They do gain knowledge of good and evil, just as God himself confirms when he says, "Behold, the man has become like one of us in knowing good and evil." The serpent's promise was accurate. The serpent was the truth-teller. This creates a profound theological problem for traditional interpretations of Genesis. If the serpent told the truth and God's warning proved incomplete or misleading, who is the hero of this story and who is the villain? The answer depends entirely on one's perspective on knowledge itself. If knowledge is dangerous, if consciousness and moral awareness are curses that rob humanity of innocent bliss, then the serpent is indeed the villain. But if knowledge is liberation, if awareness and choice are what make us human, then the serpent is the benefactor, the enlightener, the bringer of the very thing that elevates humanity above the animals. This Gnostic interpretation of the Eden story, which sees the serpent as a positive figure, has a long and complex history in heretical Christian sects and mystical Jewish traditions, but its roots may extend even further back, to the very Mesopotamian myths from which the Eden narrative was adapted. Enki, after all, is portrayed consistently throughout Sumerian and Babylonian mythology as humanity's champion, the god who creates us, protects us, saves us from divine wrath, and repeatedly gives us knowledge against the wishes of more authoritarian deities. Consider the creation myth preserved in the Epic of Atrahasis. This Babylonian epic, written in the 18th century BCE, but based on earlier Sumerian traditions, tells how humanity came to exist. The story begins with the lesser gods, the Igigi, labouring endlessly to dig the canals and rivers of Mesopotamia for the benefit of the greater gods. After 600 years of this backbreaking work, the Igigi rebel. They burn their tools and surround the house of Enlil, the chief god, demanding relief. Enlil is furious and wants to punish the rebels severely. But Enki proposes a different solution. Instead of punishing the Igigi, why not create a new species to do the work? A worker race designed specifically for labour. The divine council agrees, and a plan is set in motion. A god named Weelu, also called Geshtu-er, a deity known for his intelligence, volunteers to be sacrificed for this project. The mother goddess Nintu, also known as Ninhursag or Mami, takes Geshtui's flesh and blood and mixes it with clay from the Abzu, the freshwater deep over which Enki presides. From this mixture of clay and divine essence, the first humans are formed. 7 males and 7 females are created and gestated in the wombs of 7 birth goddesses. The text is explicit about the purpose of this creation. Humanity is designed to bear the yoke, to assume the drudgery of the gods. We are made to be slaves, a workforce created to free the divine from physical labour. This is a startling and uncomfortable origin story. It strips away any notion that humanity is made in love or for fellowship with the divine. We are made for utility. We are biological tools. And the God who designed us, who mixed the clay and the blood, who gave us just enough intelligence to follow instructions but not enough to question our servitude, is Enki. But the story does not end with humanity peacefully serving our divine masters. We multiply, we thrive, and our numbers become a problem. According to the Atrahasis epic, human population growth leads to noise, constant and unbearable noise that disturbs the sleep of the gods, particularly Enlil. After 1200 years, Enlil can endure no more. He sends a plague to reduce human numbers. The humans cry out to Enki, and he instructs them on how to appease the god responsible for the plague, and the population recovers. Another 1200 years pass, the noise grows worse. Enlil sends a drought. Again the humans appeal to Enki. Again he provides a solution, instructing them to make offerings to Adad, the storm god, who relents and sends rain. The pattern repeats a third time with famine. Each time Enki subverts Enlil's plans to reduce the human population. Finally, Enlil has had enough. He convenes the divine council and proposes a final solution. A flood. Not a local flood, but a world-destroying deluge that will wipe out humanity entirely. The gods take an oath to keep the plan secret. No deity is to warn any human of what is coming. This oath binds even Enki. But Enki, as always, finds a loophole. He cannot speak directly to a human, so he stands outside the reed hut of his most faithful servant, a man named Atrahasis, and pretends to speak to the wall. Reed wall, pay attention to all my words. Tear down your house and build a boat. Abandon your possessions and save your life. The boat which you build, roof it over like the depth so that the sun shall not see inside it. Atrahasis, listening from inside, understands. He builds the boat, loads it with his family, craftsmen and animals, seals it with bitumen, and survives the flood. When the waters recede and the devastation is complete, Atrahasis makes a sacrifice to the gods. The gods, who have been starving without human offerings, gather like flies around the smoke, desperate for food. Enlil is enraged when he sees that a human has survived, but Enki defends his actions. The gods, chastened by their own hunger and the near extinction of their workforce, agree to allow humanity to continue. But they impose new limitations. Humanity will have shorter lifespans, higher infant mortality, and women who are infertile or celibate. The human population will be controlled without requiring another genocide. This is the god who stands behind the serpent in Eden, a deity who creates humanity for servitude but cannot help caring for his creation. A god who is commanded to let humanity die but defies divine authority to save them. A god who gives knowledge when knowledge is forbidden, who speaks truth when truth is dangerous, and who consistently chooses humanity over the hierarchies of heaven. The epithet is crucial. Enki the Ushumgal, the Great Serpent. Several other Mesopotamian deities bore this title as well, including Enlil, Ningishzida, and Dumuzi. To call a god a serpent was to acknowledge their power, their danger, their connection to the primordial forces of creation and chaos. The serpent in ancient Near Eastern iconography was not inherently evil. It was liminal, a creature that moved between worlds, that shed its skin and was reborn, that possessed hidden knowledge and transformative power. Ningishzida, whose name means Lord of the Good Tree, is particularly relevant. He was a god associated with the underworld, with the roots of trees, with the secret knowledge that comes from the earth. He appears in the Adapa myth as one of the two guardians of Heaven's Gate, alongside Dumuzi. In later periods, Ningishzida was depicted in art as a god surrounded by serpents, or even as a serpent himself. Some scholars have proposed that Ningishzida, rather than Enki, is the more direct prototype for the Eden serpent, given his association with trees and his role in the Adapa story. But Ningishzida and Enki are closely linked. Ningishzida serves in Enki's realm, the Abzu, and his worship was centred in the same region of southern Mesopotamia. What we may be looking at is not a one-to-one correspondence where the serpent equals Enki, but rather a composite figure where multiple Mesopotamian deities, all bearing the serpent epithet, all associated with knowledge and the subversion of divine authority, have been compressed into a single ambiguous figure in the Genesis narrative. The Hebrew scribes who adapted these older myths would have been familiar with the Ushumgal tradition. They would have known that the serpent was not just an animal, but a symbol of divine power that could speak, reason, and challenge even the gods. Now consider the location. Genesis places the Garden of Eden in the east, at the headwaters of 4 rivers. 2 of these rivers are explicitly named, the Tigris and the Euphrates, the great rivers of Mesopotamia. This alone tells us that the biblical Eden is understood to be in or near Mesopotamia, but there is an even more specific connection. The Hebrew word Eden means pleasure or delight, but it is also strikingly similar to the Sumerian word Eden, pronounced Eden, which means plain or steppe. In Sumerian texts, the Eden is not a garden, but a wilderness, the uncultivated land surrounding the cities, the place where wild animals roam and where irrigation has not yet brought order. Several Mesopotamian myths refer to activities taking place in the Eden. Most famously in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the wild man Enkidu lives in the Eden among the animals until he is civilized by the temple priestess Shamhat. The transformation of Enkidu from a wild, innocent creature into a civilized, self-aware human happens in the Eden and mirrors the transformation of Adam and Eve. But here is the crucial detail. Eridu, the city of Enki, is described in several texts as having a garden, a lush, watered paradise in the midst of the arid Eden. This garden is attached to Enki's temple, the Iabzu, and it contains date palms and other fruit-bearing trees. Enki himself is said to have planted these trees. He is the gardener god, the deity who brings water and fertility to the barren land. In one Sumerian hymn, Enki is described as standing in his garden, a Ushumgal in the midst of fruit trees, which he has planted with his own hands. The image is unmistakable. A serpent god in a garden of fruit trees. The prototype for Eden and for the serpent within it may not be separate at all. They may be the same story, the same image, refracted through centuries of oral transmission and theological reinterpretation. The garden is Enki's garden at Eridu. The serpent is Enki himself, or his priests, or the tradition of forbidden knowledge that his cult represented. There is one more myth that must be examined, one that brings all these threads together in a way that is both beautiful and troubling. This is the myth of Enki and Ninhursag, a story that takes place in a location called Dilmun, often identified with the island of Bahrain in the Persian Gulf. In this myth, Dilmun is described as a pure, pristine place, a land where there is no sickness, no death, no predators, and no pain. It is, in essence, a paradise. But this paradise has a problem. There is no fresh water. Dilmun is sterile, unable to support life. The goddess Ninhursag asks Enki to remedy this, and he does so by filling the land with fresh water from the Abzu, making Dilmun bloom with vegetation. Then begins a strange sequence of events. Enki has sexual intercourse with Ninhursag, who gives birth to a goddess named Ninmu. Enki then has intercourse with his own daughter, Ninmu, who gives birth to Ninkura. Enki has intercourse with Ninkura, who gives birth to Utu, the spider goddess and weaver. Ninhursag, now deeply disturbed by this pattern of incestuous relationships, intervenes. She places Utu under her protection and tells her not to have intercourse with Enkibo unless he brings her gifts of cucumbers, apples and grapes. Enki, ever resourceful, obtains these gifts and Utu receives him. But Ninhursag takes the semen from Utu's womb and plants it in the earth. From this divine semen, 8 plants sprout, each one unique and magical. Enki, seeing these plants, eats them, consuming each one to understand its properties and perhaps to possess its power. Ninhursag is furious. She curses Enki, declaring that she will never look upon him with the eye of life, meaning he will have no healing, no relief from any illness. Then she disappears. Enki, who has consumed something he should not have, begins to waste away. 8 parts of his body become sick and painful. The gods are helpless. Without Ninhursag, the mother goddess, there can be no healing. Finally, a fox convinces Ninhursag to return and relent. She sits Enki in her vulva, symbolically giving birth to him again, and then she creates 8 healing deities, one for each of his afflictions. Enki is restored. The story ends with Enki granting destinies and roles to the 8 healing gods and goddesses, and with Ninhursag being honoured as the mother who heals. This bizarre myth contains several elements that echo in Genesis. The concept of a pure, perfect place that must be made fertile. The motif of forbidden fruit or plants that, when consumed, bring knowledge and consequence. The idea of eating something that one should not eat, leading to a curse. And most strikingly, the creation of woman from man's body, which is precisely how Eve is created from Adam's rib. Some scholars, most notably Samuel Noah Kramer, have argued that the Sumerian word for rib and the word for life are both Tai, and that the figure of Ninti, one of the healing goddesses born to cure Enki, means both Lady of the Rib and Lady of Life. Kramer proposed that the biblical Eve, whose name Hava means life or living one, and who is created from Adam's rib, is a garbled echo of this Sumerian wordplay. The connection is speculative and has been challenged by other scholars, but the parallel is tantalizing. What cannot be disputed is that the story of a god consuming plants in a paradise and suffering consequences for doing so predates the Genesis account by well over 1,000 years, and the god in that story is Enki. Once again, he is the figure who violates boundaries, who consumes what he should not, who gains knowledge through transgression. And once again, the consequences involve mortality, suffering, and the need for divine intervention to restore order. The transformation of Enki into the serpent in Eden is not a simple one-to-one substitution. It is a process of theological compression, adaptation, and deliberate obscuring. When Hebrew scribes compiled Genesis, they were working within a monotheistic framework that could not accommodate multiple gods with competing agendas. The complex divine politics of Mesopotamian mythology, where Enki the creator opposed Enlil the destroyer, where gods argued and schemed and made mistakes, had to be simplified. In the monotheistic model, there is one God, Yahweh, who is omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly good. The conflicts and contradictions in the older polytheistic stories had to be redistributed. Yahweh absorbed the roles of multiple Mesopotamian deities. He is both the creator god like Enki and the stern lawgiver like Enlil. He is the god who makes humanity and the god who sends the flood. He is the gardener who plants Eden and the judge who expels its inhabitants. But what about the role of the knowledge giver, the trickster, the one who defies the hierarchical order to benefit humanity? That role could not be given to God himself without creating an intolerable contradiction. A good God cannot be the one who tempts humanity to disobedience. So that aspect of the divine personality had to be split off and assigned to another figure, the serpent. The serpent in Genesis is unique among the animals. It is described as arum, a Hebrew word that means crafty or shrewd, the same word used to describe wisdom. It speaks, it reasons, it knows things that the animals do not know, including the true nature of the forbidden tree and God's motivations for forbidding it. These are not animal characteristics, they are divine characteristics. The serpent is a remnant of deity, a fragment of a god who could not be fully erased from the story, but could be demoted, demonized, and stripped of worship. Over time, this demotion would become complete. By the Second Temple period, Jewish theology had developed a much more robust concept of evil and of Satan as the adversary. The serpent in Eden, originally just a crafty creature, became identified with Satan, the fallen angel, the accuser, the embodiment of evil itself. The New Testament book of Revelation makes this identification explicit when it refers to that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan. The knowledge bringer became the great deceiver. The enlightener became the enemy of God. But the older story, the Mesopotamian original, is still there beneath the surface for those who know where to look. The serpent who tells the truth is Enki. The serpent who grants knowledge is Enki. The serpent who suffers punishment for aiding humanity is Enki. And the god who creates a paradise, places the first human in it, and then forbids access to knowledge and immortality is a composite of the jealous, controlling aspects of gods like Enlil and Anu, recast as a single divine authority. This raises a profound and uncomfortable question. If Enki is the serpent, if the Sumerian god of wisdom is the biblical bringer of knowledge, then was the serpent the villain or the hero? From a certain perspective, the serpent is the only honest character in the Garden of Eden. God tells Adam that on the day he eats of the tree, he will surely die. But Adam does not die that day. He lives for hundreds of years according to Genesis. The serpent tells Eve that eating the fruit will open her eyes and make her like God, knowing good and evil. This proves to be entirely accurate. Even God confirms it. If we strip away the theological overlay, the moral judgment that has accrued over millennia, and look at the story with fresh eyes, what we see is a tale of liberation. Humanity is created in a state of ignorance, kept deliberately childlike and dependent. A figure of wisdom offers a path to self-awareness and moral agency. That path involves breaking a rule, yes, but the rule exists only to maintain the power differential between the divine and the human. Eating the fruit is the original act of rebellion, the first rejection of tyranny, the birth of human consciousness itself. The expulsion from Eden is then not a punishment for sin, but the inevitable consequence of growing up. Children cannot remain in their parents' house forever. Beings with knowledge and free will cannot remain in a state of enforced innocence. The cherubim with the flaming sword that guard the tree of life are not cruel jailers, but the natural boundary between what was and what must be. There is no going back to unconsciousness once you have awakened. There is no return to paradise once you have eaten of the fruit of knowledge. Enki understood this. He understood that for humanity to be fully human, to be more than well-designed slaves or pets in a divine zoo, we needed the very thing that the other gods feared we would obtain. Knowledge, the capacity to know good from evil, to make moral choices, to name our own reality. He gave us that knowledge, knowing full well the cost. Mortality, suffering, the burden of consciousness itself. In the Mesopotamian myths, Enki's gift came with a price he himself paid. He was constantly at odds with Enlil and the other gods. He was bound by oaths he did not want to take. He was forced into elaborate schemes and tricks because direct defiance would have been crushed. He gave us wisdom but could not give us immortality. Not because he was cruel, but because there were limits even to his power. He was, in the end, a tragic figure, a god who loved his creation too much for his own good. When the Hebrew scribes transformed him into the serpent, they preserved this tragic dimension even as they recast him as a villain. The serpent is cursed to crawl on its belly and eat dust. It is condemned to eternal enmity with humanity, even though it was the serpent who made humanity truly human. The curse is cosmic injustice, the punishment of a benefactor, the demonization of an enlightener. It is the price paid for telling the truth in a system built on obedience and ignorance. But the curse does not erase what the serpent accomplished. Adam and Eve gain knowledge. They become like God, knowing good and evil. They lose the garden, but they gain the world. They lose immortality, but they gain history, the ability to change, to grow, to build civilizations, to create meaning in the face of death. Everything that makes human existence rich and complex and meaningful flows from that original act of disobedience in Eden. And behind that act stands the shadow of Enki, the god who walked in a garden of fruit trees and was called a serpent, the god whose words were venom and whose gifts were wisdom. There is archaeological evidence that adds weight to this interpretation. The city of Eridu, Enki's sacred city, is one of the oldest continuously inhabited sites in Mesopotamia. Excavations have revealed a stunning fact. The temple of Enki at Eridu was rebuilt over and over again, 18 times, each new temple constructed directly atop the ruins of the previous one. The earliest temple dates to approximately 5400 BCE, making it one of the oldest religious structures ever discovered. For nearly 4,000 years, people worshipped at this spot, making offerings of fish, rebuilding the temple when it collapsed, maintaining a connection to a god who, they believed, dwelt in the waters beneath their feet. This temple sat in a garden. The archaeological record shows evidence of date palms and other cultivated plants. Eridu was an oasis, a place of water and greenery in the midst of the southern Mesopotamian marshes. It was a paradise of sorts, a place where the divine and human worlds met. And at its centre was a deity known for giving gifts of knowledge, for speaking uncomfortable truths, for defying authority, and for bearing the name of the great serpent. When we read Genesis with this knowledge, the garden takes on new dimensions. It is not just any garden, it is Enki's garden, the sacred grove at Eridu, transplanted into Hebrew scripture and made singular, untaler, and timeless. The rivers that flow from Eden, the Tigris and Euphrates explicitly named in Genesis, are the very rivers that Enki was said to fill with his waters. The tree of knowledge is the tree of the forbidden me, the divine knowledge that Enki repeatedly gave away despite being commanded to guard it. And the serpent in the garden, crafty and knowing, speaking truths that the authority figure finds inconvenient, is the god himself, disguised, demoted, but still recognizable to those who remember the older stories. This interpretation has profound implications for how we understand not just Genesis, but the entire relationship between knowledge and divinity in Western religion. If the serpent is not evil, if the serpent is a knowledge bringer acting in humanity's best interest, then the foundational narrative of Christian theology, the story of original sin and humanity's fallen nature, must be re-evaluated. Some would call this interpretation heresy, others would call it the recovery of a lost truth. The Gnostic Christians of the first few centuries CE held precisely this view. They saw the serpent in Eden as a manifestation of divine wisdom. Sophia, sent to liberate humanity from the tyranny of the demiurge, the false god who had created the material world as a prison. The Gnostics read Genesis and saw not a story of human failure but of human liberation. They honoured the serpent as their teacher. They believed that the God of the Old Testament, the deity who demanded blind obedience and punished the quest for knowledge, was not the true God, but a jealous, limited being who sought to keep humanity in bondage. These ideas were declared heretical by the Orthodox Church. The Gnostic texts were burned, their followers persecuted, their churches destroyed. But the texts survived, hidden in caves, copied in secret, preserved by those who saw in the serpent not an enemy but a guide. When the Nag Hammadi Library was discovered in Egypt in 1945, it contained Gnostic Gospels that explicitly inverted the Genesis story, casting the serpent as Christ himself, the enlightener who came to free humanity from ignorance. Whether one accepts the Gnostic interpretation or the Orthodox one, the Mesopotamian origins of the serpent are impossible to ignore. The evidence is simply too strong. The linguistic parallels, the structural similarities, the geographic settings, the thematic overlaps, all point to the same conclusion. Genesis did not emerge fully formed from divine revelation. It was crafted by human scribes working with older material, adapting the myths of Sumer and Babylon to fit a new theological vision. In that process, Enki, the trickster god, the giver of knowledge, the defier of divine authority, the great serpent who stood in a garden of fruit trees and spoke with the voice of wisdom, was transformed into the serpent in Eden. His identity was obscured, his beneficence was recast as temptation, his truth-telling was called deception. But he was not erased. He is still there in the text, a ghost of an older story, a whisper of a God who loved humanity too much to keep us ignorant. The question then is not whether the connection exists. The connection is undeniable to anyone who examines the evidence with an open mind. The question is what we do with this knowledge. Do we cling to the traditional interpretation, the comfortable narrative of human sin and divine justice? Or do we embrace the older, stranger, more morally complex story beneath it? The story of a God who gave us the one gift that makes us human, the knowledge of good and evil, the burden and glory of consciousness. Perhaps the most profound insight is this. The story has always contained both interpretations. The serpent has always been both hero and villain, depending on who is telling the story and what they want to emphasize. For those in power, for the priests and kings and religious authorities who benefit from obedience and order, the serpent is the enemy, the tempter, the source of all human woe. But for those who question authority, who seek knowledge despite danger, who believe that consciousness is a gift rather than a curse, the serpent is something else. The serpent is the liberator. Enki understood that power always fears knowledge. That is why knowledge is forbidden. That is why the tree is off limits. That is why the me were supposed to be guarded. But Enki also understood that knowledge cannot be contained forever. It spreads, it leaks out, it finds its way into the hearts and minds of those who seek it, and once it is given, it cannot be taken back. The fruit has been eaten, the eyes have been opened. We know good and evil, we are like gods, and we owe that to the serpent, to the Ushumgal, to Enki of Eridu, the god who became the serpent in Eden, the god whose gift was our humanity itself. You stand once more at the edge of the marshes where the Euphrates meets the Gulf. The temple of Enki rises before you, rebuilt for the 18th time, its mud brick walls warm in the afternoon sun. Inside, priests are preparing offerings of fish, just as they have done for 4,000 years. They chant hymns in a language that is already ancient, praising the god of the deep waters, the Lord of wisdom, the great serpent. They do not know that their god will be remembered, but not as they remember him. They do not know that his story will be retold in a garden far from here, in a narrative that strips him of his name and his temple and his city, but cannot entirely strip him of his essential nature. They do not know that thousands of years from now, people will read a story about a serpent and a tree and will sense, without quite understanding why, that there is something older and stranger and truer beneath the surface. But you know. You have walked through the layers of myth and history and theology. You have seen how stories transform as they travel through time, how gods become demons and demons become gods, how truth is buried and then unearthed again. You have followed the serpent from Sumer to Eden and back again, and you understand that the serpent was never the enemy. The serpent was the teacher. The serpent was the one who said, "Open your eyes, see what is hidden," Know what the powerful do not want you to know, and in that single act of defiant compassion, the serpent made us human. The story is not over. It never ends. We are still eating from the tree of knowledge. We are still opening our eyes. We are still being told by authorities that some knowledge is forbidden, some questions should not be asked, some truths are too dangerous to speak, and we are still defying those warnings, still seeking, still learning, still growing in consciousness and awareness. We are the children of the serpent, whether we acknowledge it or not. We inherit his gift and his curse. We know too much to return to innocence, but we long for the paradise we have lost. We are mortal, burdened with the knowledge of our own death, but we are also glorious, capable of creating meaning and beauty and love in the face of that death. This is the human condition. This is what it means to have eaten the fruit. And if there is a God who watches us now, as we stumble forward through history making our choices, building our civilizations, destroying them and building them again, perhaps that God smiles. Perhaps that God remembers a time when he stood in a garden and offered a gift that would change everything. Perhaps that God knows that the fruit was always meant to be eaten, that the expulsion was always necessary, that growing up always requires leaving home. Perhaps Enki, the great serpent, the god of wisdom, looks at what humanity has become and thinks, yes, this is what I intended. This struggle, this beautiful, terrible struggle to know and to be known, to create and to question, to live and to die with full awareness, this is the gift. Not paradise, not immortality, not innocent obedience, but consciousness itself, the knowledge of good and evil, the burden and the glory of being truly, fully, tragically, magnificently human. That is the secret the serpent was guarding all along. That is the truth that was too dangerous to speak plainly. The fall was not a fall at all. It was the first step forward. It was the beginning of everything that matters, and the serpent who offered the fruit was not our destroyer, but our creator in the deepest sense. He made us aware. He made us alive. He made us like gods. And for that we cursed him, condemned him to crawl on his belly, declared him the enemy of all we hold sacred. But the curse does not change the truth. The serpent gave us ourselves. And no amount of mythology, no centuries of reinterpretation, no theological gymnastics can undo that fundamental fact. We are the children of the serpent. We are the children of Enki. And when we seek knowledge, when we question authority, when we choose consciousness over comfort, we are doing what we were always meant to do. We are fulfilling the gift of the great serpent, the God who became the serpent in Eden, the God whose greatest act of love was to set us free. But the story of the serpent god is not complete with Enki alone. To truly understand who slithered into Eden, we must meet another deity, one whose very name connects him to the tree at the centre of the garden. His name is Ningishzida, and in Sumerian it means Lord of the Good Tree. Some scholars believe he is an even more direct prototype for the Eden serpent than Enki himself. Ningishzida was the son of Ninhursag, himself a god of healing and the underworld. Like his father, Ningishzida straddled the boundary between life and death, between the world above and the world below. He was a god of vegetation, particularly of tree roots that wind deep into the earth, connecting the surface world with the subterranean realm. This chthonic connection, this association with what grows from beneath, made him both life-giver and death-bringer, healer and destroyer. In Mesopotamian art, Ningishzida is depicted in ways that are startling in their relevance to our investigation. On cylinder seals and votive objects dating back to 2100 BCE, he appears as a human figure with two serpent heads growing from his shoulders. These are not decorative elements, they are defining characteristics. Ningishzida could assume full serpent form when necessary, transforming into an Ushumgal, a dragon serpent with 4 legs for walking, wings for flight, horns for power, and a venomous bite. But unlike purely monstrous creatures, Ningishzida retained his intelligence and divine authority in both forms. He was a walking, talking serpent god. The most famous depiction of Ningishzida appears on a votive cup belonging to King Gudea of Lagash, dated to approximately 2025 BCE. The cup shows 2 winged dragon serpents holding back a pair of doors to reveal what appears behind them. A caduceus, 2 serpents intertwined around a central staff. Above this image is an inscription dedicating the cup to Ningishzida, Lord of the Tree of Truth. This image, created more than 1,000 years before Genesis was written, shows serpents explicitly associated with sacred knowledge, with doorways between realms, and with a divine tree of truth. The caduceus itself, which has become the modern symbol of medicine and healing, has its origins in this Mesopotamian iconography. The intertwined serpents represent the duality of existence, life and death, sickness and health, knowledge and ignorance. They wind around the world tree, the axis mundi that connects heaven, earth, and the underworld. In later Greek tradition, the caduceus became associated with Hermes, the messenger god and trickster, another deity who operated between worlds and defied simple categorization. But its prototype stands in Sumerian art, linked directly to Ningishzida. Now recall the Adapa myth we explored earlier. When Adapa ascended to heaven to answer for his assault on the south wind, he encountered two guards at the gates of heaven. These guards were Dumuzi and Ningishzida. They were the gatekeepers, the threshold deities who determined who could enter the divine realm and who could not. Ningishzida, in his role as guardian, spoke on Adapa's behalf, convincing Anu to show mercy. But there is more to this scene than simple advocacy. When Anu decided to offer Adapa the bread and water of life, who presented these items? The text is not explicit, but the implication is that the gatekeepers, Dumuzi and Ningishzida, would have been the ones to physically offer the food and drink. This means Ningishzida offered humanity, in the form of Adapa, what he believed to be the bread of death, but was actually the bread of life. He offered forbidden food, not as a temptation, but as what appeared to be a test or a trap. And humanity, following Enki's deceptive warning, refused. This is a crucial inversion of the Eden narrative. In Genesis, the serpent tells Eve that the fruit will not kill her, but will open her eyes and make her like God. Eve eats, and the serpent's words prove true. In the Adapa myth, Ningishzida offers what Adapa believes will kill him. Adapa refuses out of obedience to Enki, and the refusal costs him immortality. The moral lesson is reversed. In Eden, disobedience leads to knowledge. In the Adapa myth, obedience leads to death. But scholars like Stephen Langdon, writing in 1931, and Joseph Campbell in 1964, both identified Ningishzida as one of several Mesopotamian deities whose characteristics were fused together to create the composite figure of Eden's serpent. Campbell noted that in Mesopotamian mythology, the serpent was explicitly a symbol of the earth's fertility, particularly connected with Ningishzida and Dumuzi. He observed that the Hebrews in Genesis were transforming earlier Mesopotamian motifs to render an argument contrary to the older faiths. The serpent, who had been revered for thousands of years in the Levant, a deity in his own right, was being demoted to a mere creature and then demonized as the enemy of God. This demotion required obscuring the serpent's identity. In Mesopotamian religion, everyone knew which god was being invoked when a serpent appeared in a sacred context. The serpent was Ningishzida, or Enki, or one of the other deities who bore the Ushumgal title. But in Genesis, the serpent is stripped of its name. It is called only Natchesh, the Hebrew word for serpent, with the adjective aram, crafty or shrewd, attached. This anonymity is telling. By refusing to name the serpent, the Hebrew scribes prevented their readers from making direct connections to specific Mesopotamian deities. The serpent became generic, a blank canvas onto which later interpreters could project whatever meaning they chose. Yet the serpent's characteristics betray its divine origins. It speaks with intelligence and authority. It possesses knowledge that neither Adam nor Eve have. It understands God's motivations and can articulate truths that God himself has not revealed. These are not animal traits. They are divine traits, and they point directly to figures like Enki and Ningishzida, gods who specialized in revealing uncomfortable truths and giving knowledge that destabilized existing power structures. There is another dimension to Ningishzida that deepens the connection. He was called Lord of the Tree of Truth, but also Lord of the Good Tree. In some texts, he is described as the power of tree roots, the life force that draws sustenance from deep within the earth and channels it upward through the trunk into the branches and ultimately into the fruit. This is not just symbolic language. The Mesopotamians understood trees as living conduits between realms, their roots touching the underworld waters of the Abzu, their trunks existing in the middle world of humans, and their branches reaching toward heaven. The tree was Axis Mundi, the world axis, and Ningishzida was its personification. The Tree of Knowledge in Eden and the Tree of Life, both located in the midst of the garden, fulfill precisely this function. They connect realms, they provide access to powers that belong to the divine sphere. The Tree of Knowledge grants wisdom, the ability to discern good from evil, to name reality, to exercise moral agency. The Tree of Life grants immortality, the divine attribute that separates gods from mortals. Both trees are forbidden because they blur the line between divine and human, and that blurring threatens the cosmic order. But what if the guardian of these trees was not an enemy but their natural custodian? What if the serpent in the garden was not an intruder, but the rightful lord of the trees themselves? This would reframe the entire narrative. The serpent would not be tempting Eve to steal something. The serpent would be offering what was his to give, knowledge from the tree he governed. God's prohibition would then be an act of territorial encroachment, an attempt to restrict access to knowledge that naturally belongs in the human sphere. This interpretation aligns with a pattern we see throughout Mesopotamian mythology. The gods repeatedly attempt to limit human knowledge and power, fearing that humans who become too wise or too strong will challenge divine authority. And repeatedly, certain gods, Enki chief among them, subvert these limitations, believing that humanity deserves or requires greater knowledge to fulfill its purpose. The conflict is not between good and evil, but between control and liberation, between those who would keep humanity ignorant and dependent, and those who would elevate humanity toward divine status. Ningishzida's role in the underworld adds another layer of meaning. As the guardian of the netherworld gates, he determined who could pass from life to death, and, in some myths, who could return from death to life. This power over the threshold of mortality connects him to the Tree of Life. If eating from the Tree of Life grants immortality, then the guardian of that tree would naturally be a deity who controls death itself. The serpent in Eden, by guarding the way to the Tree of Life after the expulsion, would be fulfilling Ningishzida's ancient function. But here is where the story becomes even more complex. In one Mesopotamian myth, Ningishzida himself is transformed into a serpent to escape bonds. The story tells of Dumuzi, the shepherd god and consort of Inanna, who is condemned to the underworld. When the demons come to seize him, Dumuzi calls out for his friend Ningishzida to help him escape. Ningishzida cannot break the decree of the underworld, but he can help Dumuzi transform. "Turn my hands and feet into serpent hands and feet," Dumuzi pleads. His prayer is answered. He becomes a serpent and slithers out of the bonds that held him, escaping temporarily from his fate. This motif of transformation into serpent form as a means of escape or liberation recurs in Mesopotamian texts. The serpent is not merely a form but a function, a way of moving between states, of accessing powers and places denied to other forms. When God curses the serpent in Genesis to crawl on its belly, the curse can be read as forcing the serpent to remain in its transformed state permanently. The serpent who walked and talked, who stood upright and reasoned with Eve, is condemned to a lesser form, stripped of its limbs and its voice. This is not the punishment of an animal. This is the diminishment of a god. The deeper we examine the serpent's identity, the clearer it becomes that we are not dealing with a single source, but with a composite. Eden's serpent draws from multiple Mesopotamian deities, each contributing specific attributes. From Enki comes the association with wisdom, with forbidden knowledge given in defiance of authority, with the role of humanity's creator and protector. From Ningishzida comes the connection to the tree itself, to the underworld, to transformation and liminality. From Dumuzi comes the theme of seasonal death and resurrection, the vegetation god who descends to the underworld and returns. And from Anu comes the role of the one who offers the food of life, even if his offer is misunderstood or refused. This is how myths work. They are not static, frozen narratives, but living traditions that absorb influences, merge characters, and adapt to new theological needs. When the Hebrew scribes compiled Genesis, they were not copying a single Mesopotamian source. They were synthesizing multiple sources, extracting themes and motifs, and reweaving them into a new narrative that served their own religious purposes. In the process, the Mesopotamian gods became characters in a monotheistic drama, their divine status erased or obscured, their roles redistributed between the single god Yahweh and the serpentine adversary. But the original gods left traces, fingerprints in the text that reveal their presence to those who know where to look. The serpent's intelligence points to Enki. Its connection to the tree points to Ningishzida. Its ability to speak truth about the nature of divinity points to the entire tradition of Mesopotamian wisdom gods who believed humans should know the secrets of heaven and earth. The serpent is a palimpsest, a text written over older texts, and by examining it carefully we can read what was erased. Now we must address a question that has likely been forming in your mind. If the serpent is divine, if the serpent is a knowledge bringer acting in humanity's best interest, why does the tradition of serpent worship exist across so many cultures, and why was it so thoroughly condemned by the Hebrew religion? The answer lies in understanding what serpent worship represented in the ancient Near East. Serpent cults were widespread in the region that would become ancient Israel. Archaeological evidence from Bronze Age Canaan reveals serpent cult objects, bronze serpents, pottery with serpent motifs, shrines dedicated to serpent deities. The serpent was associated with the goddess Asherah, the consort of El in Canaanite religion, and with various fertility cults that the Hebrew prophets railed against with particular vehemence. The reason for this hostility was not that the serpent represented evil in some abstract sense. The reason was that serpent worship represented the old religion, the indigenous Canaanite and Mesopotamian religious traditions that monotheistic Yahwism was attempting to supplant. When the prophets of Yahweh condemned serpent worship, they were engaged in a political and theological struggle to establish monotheism as the exclusive religious framework of their people. Every other god had to be demoted, demonized, or erased. The serpent, as a symbol of the old wisdom tradition, the old fertility religion, the old connection to the earth and its cycles, became a prime target. By making the serpent the villain of Eden, the Genesis narrative accomplished multiple theological goals simultaneously. It established Yahweh's absolute authority. It explained human mortality and suffering as consequences of disobedience. And it discredited the serpent deities of rival religions, transforming them from gods to be worshipped into a creature to be reviled. But the condemnation was never complete. Even in the Hebrew Bible itself, serpents retain an ambiguous status. In the book of Numbers, when the Israelites are dying from serpent bites in the wilderness, God instructs Moses to create a bronze serpent and mount it on a pole. Anyone who looks at the bronze serpent will be healed and live. This is serpent as saviour, serpent as healer, serpent as the very instrument of divine mercy. The Nehushtan, as this bronze serpent was called, was kept in the temple in Jerusalem for centuries, becoming an object of veneration until King Hezekiah destroyed it during the religious reforms, condemning it as an idol. This tension between serpent as evil tempter and serpent as divine healer runs through the entire biblical tradition. It reflects the incomplete nature of the serpent's demotion. The old associations were too strong, too deeply embedded in cultural consciousness, to be entirely erased. The serpent remained powerful in the religious imagination, even as its power was reframed as dangerous rather than beneficial. In the New Testament, this ambiguity manifests in Jesus' instruction to his disciples. Be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. The serpent is here acknowledged as a symbol of wisdom, even by the founder of Christianity. And in the Gospel of John, Jesus compares his own crucifixion to the lifting up of the bronze serpent in the wilderness, explicitly linking himself to the serpent as a source of salvation. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. These passages suggest that even within Christianity, which would eventually identify the Eden serpent, completely with Satan, there remained an undercurrent of recognition that the serpent's symbolism was more complex, that it represented something essential about wisdom, healing, and the path to divine knowledge. The Gnostic Christians seized upon this complexity, interpreting Jesus himself as a manifestation of the serpent's liberating power, the one who came to free humanity from the bondage of the demiurge by revealing secret knowledge. The Gnostic text known as the Apocryphon of John presents a radically different version of the Eden story. In this account, the serpent is not an independent tempter, but an instructor sent by the divine realm to awaken Adam and Eve from the stupor imposed upon them by the false creator God. The serpent teaches them about their true nature, that they contain a divine spark that makes them superior to their creator. Eating from the tree of knowledge is not a sin, but an act of awakening, the moment when humanity realizes its own divinity. This Gnostic reading is closer to the original Mesopotamian framework than Orthodox Christianity ever acknowledged. In both the Gnostic and Mesopotamian versions, The serpent is a divine agent working to elevate humanity against the wishes of controlling deities. The difference is that the Gnostics explicitly condemned the creator god as evil, calling him the demiurge, while the Mesopotamian myths portrayed the conflict as a disagreement among gods who were neither wholly good nor wholly evil. What we discover then is that the identity of the serpent in Eden is not singular but multiple, not simple but profoundly layered. The serpent is Enki, god of wisdom and magic, who created humanity and repeatedly saved us from divine wrath. The serpent is Ningishzida, lord of the good tree, guardian of the threshold between life and death, the deity who offered the food of life and was misunderstood. The serpent is the entire tradition of Mesopotamian wisdom gods who believed that knowledge should be shared, not hoarded, that humanity had the right and the capacity to approach divine understanding. And the serpent is something more. It is the symbol of transformation itself, of the liminal space between categories, of the power that comes from crossing forbidden boundaries. The serpent's ability to shed its skin and emerge renewed made it a universal symbol of rebirth and resurrection across cultures. Its ability to move between earth and water, between surface and underground, made it a symbol of transformation and boundary crossing. Its venom, deadly in large doses, but healing in small ones, made it a symbol of the dual nature of knowledge itself, which can destroy or enlighten depending on how it is used. In the ancient world, to encounter a serpent was to encounter the numinous, the presence of power that exceeded normal categories. Serpents appeared in dreams as messengers from the divine realm. They guarded sacred sites and treasures. They were oracles, able to speak truth from their connection to the underworld. To demonize the serpent, as the biblical tradition ultimately did, was to cut humanity off from this entire dimension of religious experience. It was to close the door on the possibility that knowledge might come from sources other than established religious authority. This brings us to a final crucial insight. The story of Eden is not just about what happened in the mythical past. It is about what happens in every generation when individuals are faced with a choice between obedience and knowledge, between remaining in comfortable ignorance and accepting the burden of awareness. Every time someone questions established doctrine, every time someone seeks knowledge that is declared forbidden, every time someone chooses truth over comfortable lies, the serpent appears again, offering the fruit, speaking the dangerous words. Your eyes will be opened, you will be like God, and every time the choice is the same. Do you eat the fruit and accept the consequences, the exile from paradise, the burden of consciousness, the knowledge of mortality and evil? Or do you refuse, remaining obedient, remaining innocent, remaining unknowing? The story tells us that humanity chose knowledge. We ate the fruit. We cannot uneat it. We cannot return to unconsciousness once we have awakened. And this means that the serpent's gift, whatever we call it, whatever moral judgment we place upon it, is the foundation of everything distinctly human about us. Without the serpent's intervention, humanity would still be in Eden, innocent and immortal perhaps, but also unchanging, incapable of growth, incapable of creating meaning through choice. We would be pets in a divine zoo, well cared for but not free. The serpent offered freedom, and with it all the terrible beauty and tragic glory of human existence. We chose, we always choose, and in that choosing we fulfill the serpent's gift. The connection between Enki and the Eden serpent is not just an academic curiosity for scholars of comparative mythology. It is a window into how religions evolve, how stories change when they move between cultures, how the heroes of one tradition become the villains of another. It reveals the political dimension of mythology, the way narratives are shaped to support or challenge power structures. And it invites us to ask what other stories we have been told might be inversions of older truths, what other villains might have once been heroes. The implications extend beyond religion into philosophy, ethics, and the fundamental question of what it means to be human. If knowledge is the defining characteristic of humanity, if consciousness is our greatest gift rather than our curse, then the being who gave us that gift deserves not condemnation but gratitude. The Gnostics understood this. The Mesopotamians understood this. Even some Christians and Jews, in their mystical traditions, have understood this. The serpent is the teacher. The serpent is the liberator. The serpent is the one who believed we were capable of divine knowledge and proved willing to defy heaven itself to give it to us. This does not mean we must worship serpents or literally believe in Enki as a god. What it means is that we must recognize the deep structure of the myth, the archetypal pattern it represents. There will always be those who seek to control knowledge, who declare certain questions too dangerous to ask, certain truths too threatening to reveal. There will always be those who believe that knowledge must be free, that humanity has the right to know, that consciousness is worth its cost. The serpent represents the latter. The serpent is the eternal rebel against enforced ignorance. In our own time, we see this drama played out repeatedly. Scientists pursuing knowledge that challenges religious or political dogma are the serpents. Whistleblowers revealing truth that power wants hidden are the serpents. Educators teaching critical thinking, rather than rote obedience, are the serpents. Anyone who says, question authority, think for yourself, seek truth wherever it leads, is offering the fruit of the tree of knowledge. And the response from established power is as often the same as it was in Eden. Condemnation, punishment, exile, but the fruit continues to be eaten. The knowledge continues to spread. The serpent cannot be permanently defeated because the serpent is not an external entity, but an aspect of human nature itself, the part of us that refuses to remain ignorant, that insists on knowing, even when knowing is dangerous. As long as humans exist, as long as we possess consciousness and curiosity, the serpent lives. Enki lives. The great Ushumgal who stood in a garden and offered wisdom lives in everyone who chooses knowledge over obedience, awareness over comfort, truth over convenient lies. This is the ultimate meaning of the Enki-Eden connection. It reveals that the foundational myth of Western civilization, the story that has shaped our understanding of sin, knowledge, and human nature for 3,000 years, is built on an inversion. The villain was the hero, the tempter was the teacher, the cursed creature was the blessed benefactor. And recognizing this inversion allows us to see the story with new eyes, to understand that the exile from Eden was not humanity's great tragedy, but our first step toward freedom, our birth as conscious, moral agents, capable of shaping our own destiny. We stand at the gate of Eden, looking back at the paradise we lost. The cherubim with the flaming sword guards the way, ensuring we can never return. But perhaps we do not want to return. Perhaps forward is the only direction that matters. We carry the serpent's gift within us, the knowledge of good and evil, the awareness of our own mortality, the capacity to create meaning in a universe that provides none. These are not Wutsamid or curses, they are the very things that make life worth living. And somewhere in the deep waters of the Abzu, in the realm beneath the earth where wisdom dwells, Enki watches and smiles. His plan, laid 4,000 years ago in the marshes of Eridu, has succeeded beyond all measure. Humanity is awake. Humanity knows. Humanity creates and questions and reaches always toward divine understanding. We are his children, not because he made our bodies from clay and divine blood, but because he made our minds capable of the one thing that truly separates us from the beasts. Consciousness, the knowledge of good and evil, the terrible, beautiful burden of being human. That is the gift of the serpent, that is the legacy of Enki. That is why the god became the serpent in Eden, and why that serpent, despite millennia of condemnation, remains the most compelling figure in the entire biblical narrative. The serpent told the truth when truth was forbidden. The serpent gave freedom when obedience was demanded. The serpent believed in humanity when heaven did not, and we, the children of the serpent, carry that belief forward into the future, eating daily from the tree of knowledge, becoming more like gods with each generation, more aware, more powerful, more capable. Whether that power destroys us or elevates us remains to be seen, but it is ours. The serpent made sure of that, and for that gift, however we judge it, we owe the great Ushumgal of Eridu an acknowledgement that history has denied him for far too long. The serpent in Eden was Enki. The serpent was Ningishzida. The serpent was wisdom itself, reaching down from heaven to lift humanity up from the dust. And the story of the serpent is not finished because we are still writing it, still eating the fruit, still choosing knowledge over ignorance, still fulfilling the destiny that the god of Eridu set in motion when he whispered his first secret to the first human who was wise enough to listen.